The Unseen Guardian. The first golden rays of dawn crept across the weathered cobblestones of Elmwood Lane, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers into the slumbering town. Inside the small corner house with faded blue shutters and a garden overflowing with wildflowers, 72-year-old Margaret Wilson was already awake. She had been for hours. With practiced movements, her gnarled fingers folded the last sandwich and wrapped it carefully in wax paper. 24 sandwiches in total, some peanut butter and jelly, others ham and cheese, all lined up in neat rows on her kitchen counter. Next came the small paper bags into which she placed each sandwich, along with an apple, a homemade cookie, and a handwritten note with a simple message: "You matter. Keep going." Margaret's morning ritual had begun 3 years ago, shortly after her husband George passed away. The loneliness had been suffocating at first, the empty house echoing with memories of their 50 years together. Then one early morning, unable to sleep, she had wandered to the park a few blocks away and discovered them, children and teenagers, some as young as 8, others nearly adults, sleeping on benches or huddled in corners. Street children, forgotten by a world too busy to notice. That first morning, she had returned home in tears, her heart breaking for these young souls. By afternoon, she had emptied her refrigerator and returned to the park with whatever food she could carry. The suspicious glances and reluctant acceptances had stung, but Margaret was nothing if not persistent. Now, as she loaded her old red wagon with today's lunches, Margaret smiled at how far they had come. The children no longer ran when they saw her approaching. They didn't yet know her name, she had been careful about that, but they knew her face and the kindness it brought. The Sandwich Lady, they called her, unaware that she treasured this title more than any other she had held in her long life. The Daily Mission. The spring air was crisp as Margaret made her way toward Providence Park, her wagon rattling behind her. Her arthritis complained with each step, but the pain was a familiar companion these days, one she had learned to acknowledge and then ignore. The doctor had suggested she take it easy, perhaps join the senior center for morning bingo instead of these strenuous walks. He didn't know about her mission, and Margaret preferred it that way. Some kindnesses were best kept quiet. She arrived at the park just as the city was beginning to stir. Most of the children would have already left to find shelter in libraries or shopping malls where they could escape notice during the day. But Margaret knew where to leave the lunches so they would be found: a hollow tree trunk here, a gap in the stone wall there, the space behind the public restrooms. Places only the forgotten would look. As she placed the last few bags near the old gazebo, a movement caught her eye. A small figure darted behind a tree, too quick, too cautious to be a morning jogger or dog walker. "It's all right," Margaret called softly, her voice carrying on the morning breeze. "I'm just leaving these here. They're for anyone who might need them." Silence answered her. Margaret smiled and continued her task, pretending not to notice as a young girl, perhaps 12 or 13, with tangled brown hair and clothes too thin for the morning chill, watched her from behind the oak tree. This was new. Margaret usually made sure she was gone before any of the children appeared. But something about the girl's wary expression, so much like a wounded animal's, made Margaret's heart clench. "My name is Margaret," she said to the air, still not looking directly at the hiding spot. "I make too many sandwiches every morning. My husband used to help me eat them, but he's gone now. I hate seeing food go to waste." A small lie, but one she hoped might make accepting help easier. The girl didn't respond, but neither did she run away. Progress, Margaret thought. "There's peanut butter and jelly in that bag there," Margaret pointed to the closest lunch. "And a chocolate chip cookie. My special recipe." She turned to leave, her mission complete for the day, when a small voice stopped her. "Why do you do this?" Margaret turned slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements that might frighten the girl, who had emerged slightly from her hiding place. Her face was smudged with dirt, but her eyes, sharp, intelligent, and suspicious, caught Margaret off guard with their intensity. "Because everyone deserves breakfast," Margaret answered simply. "And everyone deserves to know someone cares." The girl seemed to consider this, her young face contemplative beyond her years. Finally, she nodded once and darted forward to grab the bag Margaret had pointed out before disappearing around the corner of the park. As Margaret made her slow journey home, pulling her now empty wagon, she felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the rising sun. A connection, however brief, had been made. And in a world that too often looked away from suffering, connection was everything. The unseen impact. What Margaret couldn't know was that her small acts of kindness had created ripples far beyond the immediate relief of hunger. Among the street children of Elmwood, the Sandwich Lady had become something of a legend. The notes she included were treasured, sometimes kept for months until they fell apart from being unfolded and read too many times. For many, it was the only kind word they received. 17-year-old Tyler, who had been on his own since his mother's addiction had made their home too dangerous, kept every single note in a plastic bag inside his backpack. On particularly hard days, when the temptation to give up or give in to the easier but destructive paths available to kids like him grew too strong, he would read them all, one after another. You matter. Keep going. The simple words in the neat handwriting of a stranger had saved him more times than he could count. Meanwhile, Margaret's routine continued, day after day, regardless of weather or her increasingly troublesome hip. She made the sandwiches, wrote the notes, pulled her wagon to the park, and distributed the lunches to the hiding spots. Sometimes she would glimpse one of the children. The brown-haired girl appeared more frequently now, sometimes with a small nod of acknowledgement, but mostly, her work remained anonymous, her impact unseen. Until the morning she didn't come. The first day she missed, a late November day when the first snow of the season dusted the ground, the children simply assumed she was delayed. By the second day, concern began to whisper among them. On the third day, the absence of the red wagon and its precious cargo was a tangible void that left their stomachs and hearts equally empty. Something's wrong, the brown-haired girl, whose name was Ellie, told the small group gathered in their usual meeting spot behind the abandoned gas station. She's never missed a day. Not once in all the time I've been watching. Tyler nodded, his face grim. Maybe she's sick. Or maybe. He didn't finish the thought. They all knew too well how quickly the people you relied on could disappear. We should find her, Ellie said suddenly, surprising even herself with the suggestion. She's helped us all this time. Maybe now she needs help. The idea was met with hesitation. Finding the Sandwich Lady meant acknowledging they had been watching her, following her, learning her patterns. It meant revealing themselves as the street kids everyone in town pretended not to see. But it also meant possibly helping the one person who had consistently shown them kindness without asking for anything in return. I know where she lives, Tyler finally admitted. I followed her home once, just to. I don't know, make sure she was real, I guess. He looked down, embarrassed. Blue house on Elmwood Lane. Corner lot with all the flowers. Ellie stood up, decision made. Then let's go. Now. A circle of kindness. Margaret lay in her bed, the fever making the room swim before her eyes. The doctor had been clear, pneumonia, exacerbated by her insistence on going out in all weather, required rest and medication. No more early morning walks for at least 2 weeks. The thought of the children waiting for lunches that wouldn't come brought tears to her eyes. For the 100th time, she considered calling social services, but fear held her back. Fear that intervention might make things worse, that the system might fail these children as it had failed so many others. Fear that the fragile trust she had built would be destroyed. A soft knock at the front door barely registered through her feverish haze. Probably Mrs. Henderson from next door, checking in again. The knocking persisted, growing louder, until Margaret finally called out weakly, "It's open." The sound of multiple footsteps, too many for just Mrs. Henderson, confused her. And then her bedroom door creaked open, and Margaret found herself staring at a vision her fever-addled mind couldn't quite process. 6 children stood in her doorway. 6 familiar faces she had only glimpsed in passing, now in her home, looking at her with expressions ranging from concern to awkward discomfort. Ellie stepped forward, a paper bag clutched in her hands. "You didn't come," she said simply. "So we brought lunch to you instead." The bag contained a sandwich, peanut butter and jelly with the crusts cut off, an apple, and a folded piece of paper. With trembling hands, Margaret opened the note. In careful, deliberate handwriting were the words, "You matter. Keep going." The tears came then, flowing freely down Margaret's lined face. Through the blur, she saw Tyler step forward and place a small pile of worn papers on her bedside table, all her notes, saved and returned to her when she needed their message most. "You've been taking care of us," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Now it's our turn." Over the next 2 weeks, as Margaret recovered, her house was never empty. The children came in shifts, bringing soup from the community kitchen, reading to her from her own books, or simply sitting in companionable silence. They cleaned her small house, tended her beloved garden, and made sure she took her medicine on schedule. Word spread beyond their small group. A local reporter, tipped off by a curious neighbor, wrote a story about the unlikely friendship between an elderly widow and the street children she had quietly helped for years. The article caught the attention of community leaders and charitable organizations who had long overlooked the issue of homeless youth in their town. By the time Margaret was well enough to resume her morning walks, pulling her red wagon now often accompanied by one or two of her kids, as she had begun to call them, things had changed. A vacant building near the park was being renovated into a youth shelter. A local diner had started a program offering free meals and job training to homeless teenagers. And a volunteer network had formed to provide essentials and support to children on the streets. But for Margaret, the greatest change was the end of her loneliness. Her house, once so quiet after George's passing, now regularly filled with young voices, with problems to solve and stories to share. She taught them to cook, helped them with schoolwork when they decided to return, and offered the kind of unconditional support many had never known. And every morning, she still made the sandwiches. Still wrote the notes. Still believed in the power of small kindnesses to change lives, because now she had seen that power firsthand. On her 75th birthday, Margaret awoke to find her front yard transformed. Dozens of paper lanterns hung from the trees, each containing a candle and a note. As dusk fell, the children, some still on the streets, others now in more stable situations thanks to the new community programs, gathered to light the lanterns and read the notes aloud. Each one contained a story, a moment when one of her sandwiches had provided not just physical nourishment but the emotional strength to face another day. A time when her simple words of encouragement had been the difference between giving up and keeping going. As the last lantern was lit, Ellie, now 15 and recently placed with a foster family who genuinely cared for her, stepped forward with a small cake. "You taught us that the smallest acts of kindness can change lives," she said, her voice steady and sure in a way it hadn't been when they first met. "You showed us that we matter, not just with words but with actions. And now we want you to know that you matter too, to all of us." The lanterns glowed in the evening air, casting warm light over the gathered faces, young and old, all connected by threads of kindness and recognition. Margaret looked at these children, once invisible to their community, now standing tall and being seen. And she knew that this moment, this feeling, was the true reward for all those early mornings and all those sandwiches. In a world that often moves too fast to notice those in need, the courage to slow down, to see, and to act can create miracles. Margaret's story reminds us that no act of kindness, however small, is ever wasted. The hands that give are never empty for long. So today, look around you. Who might be invisible in your world? What small act could show them they matter? Your kindness could be the light someone needs to find their way through the darkness. Remember, you have the power to change a life today. Will you use it?